Jim McCauley here, Legislative Director for League of Oregon Cities. We're going to go through a recap of the 2021 session and provide you at least with some of the high points and a couple of the low points that we faced during the session. It was certainly unprecedented due to the pandemic, economic crisis, and on top of all of that, we had a lobbying structure that was very limiting. Only legislators and staff were allowed in the Capitol. So the normal lobbying process that all of us are accustomed to was really limited. We didn't have our hallway conversations. We didn't have walks with legislators between meetings. It was effectively replaced by Zoom calls, text messages, and on occasion, phone calls. So it was very much a virtual session that none of us hope to repeat, and at least in the near future. We knew going in that a lot of our success as a league would depend on engagement of members and the ability to respond to our requests for engagement with legislators. I'm happy to report that the response from members was consistent and incredibly helpful throughout the session. I want to thank every council member, mayor, city staff that put time during this session. And in many ways, it's really hard to calculate those hours, but I do know that it's certainly measured in the thousands. And I do know that there is a direct effect or a correlation on our overall success for the session. So LOC's legislative team took on the challenges of remote communications and a bill list that went well beyond 2,000 legislative proposals. Many of these concepts would not have provided any benefits for cities, and several were repeats of past efforts to reduce local decision-making authority and impact on revenue sharing. As a result, much of the session had a defensive focus for the LOC lobby team, and due to the federal assistance from the American Rescue Plan, we also found ourselves consumed with advocating for how to spend billions of ARPA funds on generational investments for communities across Oregon. Our advocacy included constant contact with Governor Brown's office, legislative leadership in both chambers, where we were focused on that federal funding in support of a coordinated effort. Knowing this virtual session was coming forward and it would present a significant amount of communication challenges, LOC and the Association of Oregon Counties formed a local government caucus. We met monthly during the session and had up to 15 legislators and staff join us. We will be meeting with this group during the interim to help frame a plan for moving forward, but it was a great educational platform and allowed for some great dialogue and candid conversations with legislators. Oregon's 81st legislative session saw some significant wins for cities, but I'll let our lobbyists get into the details of those as we go forward. So with that, I'm going to stop and let Ariel go ahead and start.
Thanks, Jim. I'm Ariel Nelson, your LOC lobbyist for all things housing, land use, and development. This session was definitely a historic session in terms of investments on housing and homelessness. The league went into the 2021 session with housing and services investments being a top priority. And we saw the legislature respond with investments of over $765 million across the housing spectrum. So everything from shelter and homelessness resources to the development of affordable rental housing, the preservation of existing affordable housing, and then investments and programs in affordable home ownership and repair and rehab of existing home ownership for income qualified folks. So really a recognition and a commitment to addressing housing needs, again, across that spectrum. Those investments were spread between Senate Bill 5011, which is the budget bill for Oregon Housing and Community Services, our state's housing finance agency. And we also saw significant investments included in the end of session Christmas tree bill, House Bill 5006, which you'll hear quite a bit about from my colleagues as we saw significant investments across the board, but definitely a focus on housing in this bill. And those investments were in combination of state general fund and federal ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act dollars, funding, again, a variety of resources. But we did see a focus on homelessness and shelter. There were specific allocations to local governments to stand up navigation centers and emergency shelters to address homelessness. On the funding side, we also saw an allocation in House Bill 2004 at the end of session to continue supporting Project Turnkey, which is an effort that the LOC, in partnership with Association of Oregon Counties and other stakeholders, has been a strong sponsor and partner behind with Oregon Community Foundation. This is the funding that the legislature initially awarded this past fall in an emergency board allocation, $65 million to acquire and convert hotel or motels into emergency shelters and long-term into affordable housing. The legislature allocated an additional $9.5 million through House Bill 2004 in the session to continue that work and continue that success to both provide stable homes for people experiencing homelessness and those who were displaced and lost their homes due to wildfire across the state. Another bill under the housing umbrella, House Bill 2100, will be tracking into the interim as it sets up a task force to look into the state's funding source and program for emergency housing assistance dollars that go out through the community action agencies statewide. There will be a multi-sector stakeholder task force that the LOC will be participating on to look at how to bring in additional providers and additional entities to be part of that funding conversation statewide. On the policy front, we saw two major bills around homelessness that impact local governments. House Bill 3115 is a bill that LOC worked very closely on as part of a work group ahead of session with counties and other cities, as well as the Oregon Law Center. And this bill is a continuation or a reflection of the high points of the federal Ninth Circuit court case, Martin versus City of Boise. And so this bill basically reflects that holding that local regulations surrounding homeless camping activities, sitting, lying, sleeping must be objectively reasonable in regards to the totality of the circumstances. Again, this is a reflection of that federal court case with a major change being that your actual ordinance will need to reflect that, will need to be reasonable, not just the enforcement. So the LOC will be partnering again with Oregon Law Center and AOC to be putting out resources, technical assistance, and some training documents for our city members well ahead of the implementation date for that bill. Cities are required, if their ordinances do need updating, that work will have to be done by July of 2023. So we'll be putting out an array of resources ahead of that date to support cities. The other bill to be aware of is House Bill 3124, which updates the existing state requirement that if an entity is going to remove a campsite, you have to post notice in advance before removing a campsite. And that notice was at 24 hours, and that's now been extended to 72 hours of posted written notice. Moving on to the development side, another a big conversation this session was around system development charges. The LOC partnered with our other local government partners at special districts, counties, and parks to successfully push back on legislation that would have created preemptions and mandates on how jurisdictions assess or collect system development charges, or SDCs. We were able to kill that legislation, and instead we saw a bill pass that directs the state and funds the state to perform a comprehensive study on system development charges on cost drivers of development. So that's a bill that we'll be watching and participating in that study. It does ask local governments to contribute data and respond to the agencies who will be conducting this study. And then finally on land use, we did see a focus on land use looking at potential barriers in the state land use process that the legislature saw as standing in the way of goals like increasing citing emergency shelters, lack of childcare centers. So there was definitely a focus and a trend on preempting the local land use process. We saw a lot of bills with the language notwithstanding land use, and we worked very hard to ensure that any preemptions were very narrowly crafted and that they were going to be implementable at the local level. So House Bill 2006 continues a bill that was passed for a 90-day period during the first special session in July. This House Bill 2006 brings it back and essentially expedites and streamlines the process to approve an emergency shelter at the local level. Similarly, House Bill 3261 sets up a similar expedited process bypassing the local land use system to convert hotel, motel, still shelter in support of the Project Turnkey effort. And then House Bill 3102 sets up a similar process when it comes to citing childcare facilities or childcare homes and residential homes. Those are all very limited to those specific priorities and still allow a city to apply building code and life safety regulations. Another major bill on the land use front was Senate Bill 8, which similarly kind of expands and streamlines the zoning approval process for affordable housing on non-residential land. It provides a statewide density bonus for affordable housing that is on residential land. And then it gives affordable housing developers access to attorney fee repayment or reimbursement if they prevail in a land use appeal case. The LOC was very involved in this bill to ensure that the impact on local governments, again, was narrow and in support of removing barriers to affordable housing. The bill does not go as far. It still protects local siting and design standards, building code, those kinds of regulations that cities may still apply to affordable housing. We did see on the funding side for land use in the DLCD, Department of Land Use and Conservation budget bill, we've seen an increase in the funding for local government technical assistance, which is really key to ensuring that our city members can have access to consultants and have the capacity to respond to new legislation and to implement it. So we have a total of $5.5 million for the biennium, which is the most funding we've seen in this at DLCD for some years. Half of that money will be focused on supporting the continued implementation of House Bill 2001, the Middle Housing Bill from 2019, as well as House Bill 2003 also from 2019, which requires cities above 10,000 in population to produce what are called housing production strategies. So there's actually funding available for cities to complete this work. The remaining extra $2 million will be largely available to help cities with a focus on smaller cities to do land use updates, other capacity needs to further their housing goals and housing needs at the local level. And then finally, we saw a budget note in that Christmas tree bill, House Bill 5006, directing DLCD along with Oregon Housing Community Services to continue working towards a regional housing needs analysis, regional planning. This was work that was directed and funded in 2019 through House Bill 2003, and more research needs to be done, more data analysis needs to be done if the state is going to move towards a regional model. So that was funded and directed the agency to continue that work, and cities will remain at the table to ensure that direction and that effort aligns with local practices. From my end on housing and land use, and I'm happy to turn it on to my next colleague, Jenna.
Thanks, Ariel. I'm Jenna Jones. For those that don't know me, I handle broadband telecommunications and cable issues, and most recently, energy and environment issues. So that's what I'll be covering today. One thing that I don't think anyone got out of COVID thinking was that broadband is not essential. Broadband was a very big priority for the legislature this year, and it was a priority for the league as well. And so there are a couple of really good wins related to broadband. First is House Bill 2654. This bill expands existing electric cooperative easements to allow for the provision of broadband services. This bill does exempt existing electric easements in city rights of way, and that's to be clear that this does not preempt a city from allowing electric cooperatives from providing broadband services in an easement that is granted by the city. It just means that this electric cooperative needs to work with the city and get authorization at the local level to expand their easement. However, this will be a really big win for electric cooperatives in rural parts of the state as they get into the broadband game. Next bill, as mentioned in prior summaries, House Bill 5006 was the Christmas tree bill. There was $120 million of ARPA funds going to Business Oregon's broadband fund related to broadband. This will help with broadband grants and loans, and it will include projects for planning, development, and broadband service infrastructure. We're also hoping that there'll be a little bit of technical assistance money in this large sum of dollars. The next big thing is House Bill 5023, which was the Business Oregon budget. Business Oregon oversees the Oregon Broadband Office. That office has been instated since 2018. However, that's only been staffed with one person. The Business Oregon budget does have additional funding for 4 FTE for the broadband office. And so we are hoping that those extra positions will help carry out the mission of the broadband office and provide critical technical assistance to various communities. Another budget bill that's important is House Bill 5032. This is the Public Utilities Commission budget. Under 5032, there's an increase to the Residential Service Protection Fund surcharge rate from 10 cents to 12 cents. This increase will support the OTAP or Oregon Lifeline program, which will increase the discount from $3.50 to $10 for eligible low-income households subscribing to phone or broadband internet access service subsidies. This subsidy will be really critical to make sure that broadband stays affordable for those who need it. One lost this session that we're hoping will come back in 2022 was House Bill 3256. This bill would have created the Connecting Oregon Libraries Fund. It would have been similar to the Connecting Oregon Schools Fund, which was created in 2018. This bill would have created a dedicated fund for libraries and would have helped them be more competitive for federal E-rate program dollars. As many people know, libraries serve as an important internet access point for communities and as anchor institutions for the expansion of broadband. We're really disappointed to see this fail, but we're hoping it'll come back in 2022 because I know that libraries have been a critical piece to broadband service for community members during this pandemic, with people parking in parking lots just to leverage the Wi-Fi. So we'll see that coming back, hopefully. Now to kind of transition out of broadband and telecom world and go into the energy and environment world. One bill is House Bill 2395. This amends the bag ban definitions from 2019. It expands the definition of recycled paper checkout bag to include non-wood renewable fiber and a combination of post-consumer recyclable fiber and non-wood renewable fiber, along with post-consumer recycled fiber in that definition. What this really means to you is that you should check out this bill if you have local ordinances, charter provisions, or resolutions that deal with a bag ban, and make sure that they are consistent with the new expanded definition in this bill. Moving on to a very great win and hard win of this session was Senate Bill 582. This is the recycling modernization bill. The LOC worked with a coalition of over 20 entities to support 582. Its purpose was to create significant modifications to the Oregon recycling system. This bill levels the playing field of recycling across the state by expanding access to effective recycling in rural communities, eliminating confusion about what can be recycled, and requiring companies that use specific packaging to have a stake in the system to which they are contributing to. So like I said, Senate Bill 582 modernizes the Oregon recycling system. It establishes a producer responsibility model and requires certain producers of covered products to financially contribute to and participate in an approved producer responsibility organization. They do this through annual funds. Those funds collected through the PRO, or Producer Responsibility Organization, will be made available to local governments for eligible costs. Some of those costs include the cost of transporting covered products from a recycling depot and reload facility to a commingled recycling process facility or a responsible end market. We know that's a big issue, especially for folks in rural places. Compensation through the PRO will either happen in advance or as a reimbursement model. And then the bill authorizes the Environmental Quality Commission to adopt a uniform standard list of materials that are suitable for recycling collection. Previously, many will know that the list of recycled materials has varied locally, and that's kind of contributed to the fact of an ongoing consumer confusion and inequities in recycling contamination. The bill prohibits commingled recyclables collected under the Opportunity to Recycle Act from being delivered to commingled processing facilities unless such facilities meet performance standards and specified equity considerations. Those equity provisions in the bill are not operative until January 1, 2027. So there's time to kind of get up to snuff if you need to. Lastly, the bill creates the Oregon Recycling System Advisory Council, and they will make recommendations to both DEQ and the pros under a variety of topics and submit reports to the legislator every 2 years. There are a couple of requirements for cities under this bill, so I'll tick them off for you. Under Senate Bill 582, local governments are required to provide multifamily properties with a list of collection materials from that statewide uniform list and ensure that there's adequate space and container placement for multifamily properties and demonstrate a plan for ensuring access for new constructions and significant remodels if the city provides the opportunity to recycle. One of those eligible costs that I mentioned above from the PRO funds includes upgrading and establishing recycling at multifamily facilities. The next requirement is that local governments will be required to use educational resources. The bill requires pros to develop and make available to local governments culturally responsible educational resources to promote the uniform statewide recycling list. Local governments are required to utilize those resources. Next, there is a requirement that there will be newly purchased roll carts, bins, and containers that contain at least 10% verified post-consumer content. By that requirement goes into effect by January 1, 2026. So there's time there. And then lastly, local governments will need to identify to DEQ the local government service providers that are authorized to receive funding or reimbursement directly from the pros. Another big issue that came up during this session was clean energy. There were 3 bills in particular that kind of focused on 100% clean energy. The first one that I'll talk about is the one that passed. It's House Bill 2021. This requires greenhouse gas emissions by investor-owned electric utilities. This would require the baseline emissions to be below 80% by 2030, 90% below baseline emissions by 2035, and it to be 100% below baseline emission levels by 2040. Another big part of this is that the bill creates natural gas plant restrictions. It restricts the Oregon Energy Facility Siting Council from issuing new or amended site certificates for fossil fueled energy facilities that emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The big part that cities will want to be excited about is that this bill creates $50 million for Community Resilient Renewable Investment Fund. This fund will provide competitive grants for planning or developing eligible community renewable energy projects less than 20 megawatts. Oregon Department of Energy is responsible for developing and implementing the new Community Resilient Renewables Incentive Programs. Next, this bill creates a green tariff program. IOUs are permitted to collaborate with local governments to develop PUC-approved green energy electricity rates in alignment with local government renewable or clean energy goals to serve the consumers in their jurisdiction. There are also some responsible labor standards for any project that is greater than 10 megawatts. This bill also will increase some of the thresholds to the renewable portfolio standard, community-based renewable energy targets for IOUs. And then there will be a study done by ODO on the small scale renewable energy. A similar bill to House Bill 2021 was Senate Bill 784. This would have had a similar green tariff program. It would have also covered investor-owned utilities, but there were a couple of provisions related to voluntary natural gas emissions reductions for natural gas utilities. Most of the things in this bill ended up in House Bill 2021 without that natural gas piece. The last bill that I'll cover is House Bill 3221. This was a bill that would have authorized the Oregon Public Utility Commission to work with investor-owned utilities to offer a voluntary community-wide green tariff known as the Oregon Renewable Options Program. The Oregon Renewable Options Program would have enabled local governments, local service districts, and tribes served by investor-owned utilities to make decisions regarding the energy sources that power and provide resilience for the residents and businesses in their community. Unfortunately, this bill did not pass, though the LOC was very supportive of it. That's all I got, so I will kick it over to Mark.
Thanks, Jenna. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Mark Garst. I'm the League's lobbyist for tax, finance, and economic development. I think that both Ariel and Jenna kind of hinted a little bit about one of the biggest things that we were watching this session, and that was the budget. The state revenues came in well above what we expected when we started the pandemic. And in fact, we're looking at record high revenues just on the income tax side, say. But on top of that, we had $2.6 billion worth of money coming in from the American Rescue Plan Act, and the legislature allocated pretty much all of that money. So the big bill to look at is the Christmas tree bill. That's House Bill 5006. Other bills to look at are the lottery bond authorization bill, that's Senate Bill 5534, and House Bill 5042, which we call the program change bill. But I'm really going to focus a little bit on that Christmas tree bill. And again, that's House Bill 5006. So big chunks of that money were allocated to individual cities. And if you go into OLIS, the Oregon Legislative Information System, you can look for a budget report that appears on the materials page of that bill. And you can search for your city's name by hitting Control F and see if there are individual projects dedicated to you. You're probably aware of them, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are some people who are going to get some good news there. In that line, there's 173 million in lottery bond proceeds that are outlined really in Senate Bill 5534, but they appear again in 5506. There's 240 million in ARPA projects that were dedicated based off of legislative district, and DAS is still doing some looking at those. That is ARPA money, so it has to meet the same requirements that you'll have to meet when you go to spend your own ARPA dollars. But you can see a list of those projects, again, if you just go to the budget report that's available online. Also, $276 million in drinking water, stormwater, and sanitary sewer projects are outlined, again, by city. And so that money is all dedicated to where it's going to go. On the other side, there are tremendous resources. They're not dedicated, and these are programs that once they're stood up by various agencies, cities will be able to apply for. So we have the $120 million for broadband that Jenna mentioned. We have $410 million in bonds for affordable housing, developing affordable housing units, and that was something that Ariel mentioned. On top of that, there's $100 million for rebuilding related to the 2020 wildfires. There's $100 million between both general funds and lottery bonds for the Special Public Works Fund, which is something that we really work to get additional resources for. There is more than $5 million financial assistance for planning and other needs in communities. And I think that was something that Ariel also talked about. So really just a tremendous amount of money in that Christmas tree bill, and certainly something that we're going to be keeping our eye on as DAS figures out how to get that money out. Some of it requires sale of bonds. That'll slow it down. Some of it's going to require review. So I really wouldn't expect to see a lot of that money until the fall at the earliest, but it's coming, and that is great news. On the economic development front, there were a couple bills that we worked particularly hard on. House Bill 2343 gives local governments the option, it's not a requirement, to waive employment requirements on enterprise zone projects. We know a lot of our employers really were struggling due to COVID. Maybe they couldn't have as many people on the shop floor. Maybe it was hard to find workers. Maybe they had to shut down for a while because there were supply chain disruptions. So if you know of companies and you're the zone sponsor, you have the ability to waive those employment requirements. You can do it one of two ways, and they're outlined in the bill. We'll continue to work with OEDA on how to administer that program exactly, but we think that was a big win for us. That was one of our legislative priorities, and we were happy to get something over the finish line. House Bill 2518, another good one for cities. This establishes the Oregon Brownfield Properties Revitalization Fund, and that'll be a fund that will make forgivable loans to reimburse private owners for cleaning up brownfields. So that's something we can look forward to. Over on the tax side, I'll start off with the really bad news. We had really sought local marijuana tax increase. It's not lost on any cities that, you know, the voters really kind of stung us a little bit with Measure 110. It's going to reduce our share of the state marijuana tax by over 70%. And we thought one way to make that up would be to get an ability to increase the local tax beyond the current 3% limit. We were able to get the bill through the Senate, but unfortunately, when it got over to the House, it got stalled, and the House decided not to act on the bill. Now, silver lining, I think that there's a broad recognition that we have an issue here and that something has to be done. It doesn't make sense to hold us to the same low threshold for a local tax when we're not getting the share of the state tax that we thought we were going to get. So there will be a work group in the interim. We'll obviously be heavily engaged, and our hope is that we'll be able to come up with something that will help to backfill those Measure 110 losses and to make sure that we get a share of future increases as that market grows naturally. On the property tax side, you know, there were a lot of bills out there, a lot of exemption bills. Say, I'll kind of break them into a couple categories. We had a lot of bills that related to housing. So we had House Bill 2438. It's a rural housing exemption for very small counties. We had a couple bills that dealt with existing affordable housing exemptions and maybe tweak them a little bit or extended sunsets. Those would include House Bill 2446, which was a sunset extension. House Bill 2456, which is the kind of broad tax revisers bill, but it included some local options to change some definitions around existing programs or to extend out some time that folks would have to build houses, say in the single unit affordable housing exemption. Another bill in that vein would be House Bill 3275, which is a housing land trust bill that exempts the land under properties that are owned by a housing land trust where the land is held in trust. Senate Bill 141 made some tweaks to the vertical housing exemption. You know, I wouldn't say that any of these are really groundbreaking, but, you know, I worked very closely with Ariel on these. Obviously, housing is her portfolio. And generally, we think that these fall into our broad goals for housing. And so we consider these all to be good bills. Another broad category of bills were bills that deal with wildfire and housing. So we had House Bill 2247, that is a tax penalty waiver, actually for business property, but for folks who maybe were paid late due to either COVID or wildfires. We had House Bill 2341, which was a work group bill we started working on in the fall of 2020 when the fires were still burning. That changes how property taxes are prorated to make sure that if someone does lose their house, that they get treated fairly. And then another bill is Senate Bill 464, which is a wildfire tax cancellation bill. We had some mixed feelings about this. We worked really hard. We really wanted the benefit that folks received to be tied to the loss that they received. And we got some ways on that. Senate Bill 464 is better now than when it was initially came out, but we still have some concerns, and we'll be watching the local processes as they work their way through. That bill would allow a county to waive the property taxes for all the properties in a fire zone if they were denied use or if they suffered any damage. So we'll keep an eye on that one. Other bill that I would talk about on the property tax side is House Bill 2634. We were pretty hard on this bill to get in some amendments that are just beneficial to property owners. I know that everybody hates to get those calls when tax time comes. Why are my taxes so high? Why is the city hitting me so hard with this rate? Well, this bill helps seniors out a little bit. First of all, a lot of times they don't realize they have a problem until their tax bill comes. This allows them to apply to get into the senior deferral program late, which will be a big benefit to them. It also makes it easier for surviving spouses or heirs, disabled heirs, to stay in the program. If, say, someone was in the program, they died, but the person that lived with them maybe hadn't been in the house for 5 years, this would allow those folks to continue to be in the program. It also makes some changes to what houses are allowed to participate out in rural Oregon. And so it allows a little bit more entry into the program. So we're excited about that. There's a big bill we stopped, Senate Bill 299, and Jim talked about when cities when we asked, you guys stood up. This is one where you really stood up. This was the Children's Service District bill, 5th time it's been around the block, and we were able to stop it again, and mostly because you folks reached out to your members and let them know that, you know, we can't compete with a new district on property taxes. Measure 5 limits, you know, make winners and losers, and we can't be a loser when we already are so limited on what we can raise for property tax levies. There was no real action on property tax reform, unfortunately. That's going to be one for another day. I think that as soon as we got into this virtual session, you know, as Jim described it, it was clear that the type of cooperation and communication that would be necessary to really get something like property tax reform across the line, not going to be there. So, you know, we're working on a plan. We've been working with work groups. I've had conversations with a number of you, but we're hopeful that you know, we'll continue to move the ball on property tax reform. But this really was not the session to make that happen. So that is a pretty good summary. I mean, obviously you'll want to look to the bill summary publication for more details on some of this stuff, but I think that those are kind of hitting some of the highlights, and I will pass it over to Scott so we can hear about his general government bills.
Again, I'm Scott Winkels. I'm your lobbyist on general government and human resources issues. So that encompasses anything your city does in relation to its, as it relates to its employees, as well as your public safety, open meetings, public records, police reform, and behavioral health. And those are the 2 areas where I'm going to start. It's police reform. I'm not going to go into every bill here. We can look to the bill summary. Also, please look for a couple of sessions on this during conference. The first bill that I think was a huge achievement for cities, the policing profession, and the public was House Bill 2930. This bill was long overdue reform of our arbitration system that will give management the ability to greater ability to have disciplinary decisions stick. This is a bill that if most police officers in Oregon are actually never even going to encounter, but for those few where there are some issues and they're ill-suited to the profession, the ability for management to make serious corrections and terminate has increased greatly. The other bill that I think anchors the police reform package of bills is House Bill 2936. This makes some findings that things like racist behavior, membership in white nationalist militant organizations is unacceptable in policing, but it also gives agencies the ability to screen employees better. We finally have the ability to compel former employers to give honest reviews. We have greater background check tools to vet employees and access to social media accounts that were previously prohibited to us. So those 2 of the bills are the real highlights in that reform package. But again, look for more in the summary. And these were some difficult conversations to have, but came out, I think, in benefit to all parties involved. We did see some changes to the open meeting laws. House Bill 2560, chief sponsor on that was Representative Meek. This bill is going to require that our public meetings, the governing body of the public body, so I think that's City Council, will have to take virtual electronic testimony to the extent reasonable. There's some pretty good legislative history as to what that we mean by reasonable. We're talking about, you know, added costs, people who are disruptive. Those things can't get in the way of the meeting. So take a look at that bill in the summary as well. I also want to talk about behavioral health. This was really transformational this session, and I think, and what's really remarkable about this is that I don't think that there was a plan to spend the $457 million the legislature actually allocated at the beginning of the session. This was something that developed over time in deep conversations. I think going into this session, we were looking at maybe, you know, 25 million to add to respite care. A couple of other changes on civil holds, things like that. And what the legislature did is said, no, we're going big. thanks to a lot of, the budget forecast certainly helped. The ARPA money, the infusion of federal cash certainly helped, but really it was political will that moved this one across. And so what we're going to see is $457 million spent in some key areas. First is workforce development. We don't have enough people to provide behavioral health services in the state. That's going to change. It's going to add respite care and there are some provisions in the respite care legislation as well that would allow law enforcement to divert a potential inmate into care as opposed to a jail, which would be a huge benefit for everybody. We treat patients like patients as opposed to them becoming an inmate. We're also going to see a massive influx in crisis intervention care. So people on the street, before they get intervention, before they get into crisis, huge benefit to the patient as well as the public, and allows law enforcement to focus on what they're trained to do, and let healthcare professionals do what they're trained to do for everybody's good. With that, I will turn it back over to you, Jim.
Great. Thanks very much, Scott. I think what I'll do at this point is I'll get straight into my portfolio. So my focus during session and off session would be on transportation, building codes, and one that was an additional piece here this last time was really wildfire policy. So I'm going to start out with really the easy piece, and that would be the transportation side. Not a tremendous amount of I'll say significant policy bills that move through the process, but there's a few notable pieces that I think are worth bringing forward. So HB 3055 is really the omnibus transportation bill that did come forward. And there's probably 30 or 40 different sections in it. The ones of significance for cities is there was some added clarity for fuel tax authority for cities. There was an issue in advance of session that prompted ODOT to provide some additional clarity. So that was taken care of. There's also policy statements in there in terms of tolling. I'll say effectively the idea here is to make sure that when tolling is integrated into the transportation infrastructure in Oregon, it will be done so for both congestion purposes, but also for building projects is effectively what it comes down to. There's also going to be some flexibility introduced for the use of revenue from House Bill 2017, which was the major transportation bill back in 2017 to essentially allow for some revenue use for both the I-5 project, Rose Quarter project, as well as I-205. There was some issues and things of that nature in terms of making sure that some of the added revenue that was going to be coming forward would have the ability to be used for both of them. And that was an important piece going forward. There's a couple of elements that we don't normally get into, but I think are important to bring up, and that's effectively regarding electric vehicles, which is going to become an important component moving forward within our transportation system, as well as for some of the infrastructure investments that are out there. House Bill 2180 is an EV infrastructure component essentially for new construction. It amends the state building code to require certain new construction EV capacity essentially at multifamily units, as well as private buildings. The idea is to physically get the conduit physically in to the project, not so much to get the actual charging stations in place. The idea is to, again, get that infrastructure in place so that when it makes sense to make the investment in those charging stations, you don't have to rip up a lot of the street and things of that nature to get this put in. House Bill 2165 is a DEQ EV, electric vehicle rebate program. And what they've done is they removed the sunset on it to make sure that public agencies are going to be able to transition into that EV fleet moving forward for a lot of the light vehicles that are out there. I'm going to move into the wildfire piece, which really took up a tremendous amount of my time as well as other staff. Mark and Ariel both mentioned components within not just the property tax component are trying to provide some assistance for families and communities that were hit hard, but also really on the housing side as well. So my focus really was on Senate Bill 762. This essentially is a comprehensive approach to wildfire policy. Myself, as well as our partners out there, which include Association of Oregon Counties, I'll say private property rights groups, and a whole mix of other interests out there. We ended up working throughout the session, and this is really kind of a tail end completion during session. And like I said, it is a comprehensive policy approach to reducing wildfire risk in that wildland-urban interface. And there are a series of different work groups on this bill and advisory committees, of which I've already had my first advisory committee meeting earlier this week, and there'll be more as this bill gets rolled out in the future. The other piece that is certainly worthy of noting is third-party building official. For many of you, that has been a debate for 3 years. The work that was provided during the interim and the efforts from a number of the city members of League of Oregon Cities helped produce Senate Bill 866. It essentially provides a solution or a pathway for the cities who had a third-party building official as of 2018 to keep the program with some added administrative measures for improved transparency and oversight. Those administrative steps are going to include designated city employee for oversight, some added education for that city designee, as well as some increased transparency for budget review or budget and revenue related to the fee structure associated with that third-party building inspection program that many cities have got. So that's important. And I was really happy to see us finally reach, I'll say, a kind of a consensus point on this bill to be able to move it forward through the legislative process. The other area that I'm going to try to do my best to walk through is related to water quality. So for many of you know that Tracy Rainey has left the League of Oregon Cities and has moved on to Clean Water Services. We are in the process of hiring for that position and hope to have somebody in place by September. The other thing I will certainly want to note with this, and I think everybody has brought this up, please take a look at the bill summary that has much more detail than we can possibly fit into this conversation today. So I'm going to start out with really a significant win for the league and work that Tracy has put forward for a number of years, and that's labeling requirements for wipes. Those have been a long-term problem for any agency that deals with water quality and has to deal with the treatment side. Those wipes clog up the system. So this effectively is a bill that is going to provide some educational labeling on the consumer side to make sure we can get it physically out of the waste stream. Pretty important for a lot of those wastewater treatment facilities out there, and the potential impact is literally millions of dollars related to having to clean those wipes out of the system. So education is going to take time. The labeling will be in place, but it's definitely a great path forward and was part of the league's Water and Wastewater Policy Committee recommendations back from 2020. There's also a bill that went through process. That's House Bill 3103, stored water transfers. This was a bill request by the league and other individual cities to establish a process to restore Oregon's Water Resources Department's ability to process and approve transfer requests seeking to change the type of use for stored water. Very important for a lot of those communities moving forward. And again, significant value for us and the work that Tracy's been doing for a number of years. You've already heard a number of places on the success that we had with what's referred to as a Christmas tree bill, House Bill 5006. In any given year, I'll say water-related investments number probably in the $30 to $50 million for a biennium. This truly was a generational win for water-related projects. Collectively, somewhere north of $550 million is going to be invested in water projects across the state, additional funding for OWEB, as an example, received some funding out of this. DEQ received funding out of this as far as agencies. ODF&W received funding through fish screens and fish passage and things of that nature. Oregon Water Resources Department. So there are an awful lot of winners in this entire investment strategy moving forward with water quality. And the Special Public Works Fund got $100 million of infusion of new money. And again, typically that scale is really only about $30 million of biennium. So this is very significant. The final piece on the water item that I thought was important to bring up is really the USGS groundwater studies and budgets, and that's House Bill 2018. This is basically setting up Oregon Water Resources Department to enter into some cost match agreements with United States Geological Survey for groundwater studies. And again, this is all going to be helpful for producing the data that we're going to need to take a serious look at for water supply related issues as we are continuing to enter significant climate impacts down the road. Another area that Tracy Rainey covered for the league was public contracting. I'd like to highlight a couple of the bills from this session that are important for members to take a look at. House Bill 3082 effectively was a change in the competitive bid price. This raises the contract price at which public improvement contract solicitations are exempt from competitive bidding requirements, and it is going from $5,000 to $10,000. House Bill 2682, equipment leasing, requires a person that rents a utility vehicle to a contracting agency to provide records that describe in detail the results of the most recent inspection. Those have to cover the utility vehicle's traction, structure, powertrain, control components, and related parts. Senate Bill 493 was one of the bigger disappointments of this session. This is a prevailing wage bill that, for those members that are familiar with the process, is historically set by surveys. And instead of going with surveys in the future from your region, it's going to be set off the collective bargaining agreement for a particular trade or occupation that exists at the local level. And we'll be using the highest of those wage rates within that prevailing wage setting and within that collective bargaining agreement. We are very concerned that this may have a more significant impact in rural communities that don't have quite a range of collective bargaining and may be at a disadvantage from being able to absorb those additional costs that we fully expect to come as a result of this. The league put up a valiant effort trying to defeat this bill or improve it. And in the end, we were unable to stop the bill and fully expect increased costs over time. And we are going to be asking our members to take a serious look at public contract costs and projects over time, because we do, again, believe this will be a significant increase in those costs, potentially either stopping projects from being able to be completed or trimming the scope of those projects over time as they try to absorb these increased costs of labor. The final piece that was part of the public contracting segment of Tracy's work was Senate Bill 420. This is the community benefit contract and essentially permits contracting agencies or a local contract review board to enact or adopt as appropriate an ordinance, resolution, rule, regulation, or other legislative or administrative measures to designate certain public improvement contracts as a community benefit contract. We think this actually is going to be a benefit to members out there and will hopefully provide some flexibility in contracting out a variety of different projects in your community. You know, if there's something for me to close on that I think is important to really kind of focus in on for this session is we really had significant wins. I'll say policies related to wildfire, housing, as well as water, police reform were really at center stage for the league. I think the institutional investments that we've already spoken about are absolutely across the board. And I would say that entering the session, I'm not sure I could have expected or anticipated the scale of investment that we had success moving forward on. It didn't happen by accident. It was really very much a team effort. Awesome group of lobbyists advocating 24/7, literally throughout the entire session, and being able to advocate for some of these investments that the state eventually was able to move forward with. We were obviously also helped by the ARPA money, and the fact that our budget deficit was no longer a deficit after a year and was a substantial surplus of revenue as well. The other thing I want to make sure I mention too is that this success doesn't happen without membership involvement. And I wish I could count the number of times that we actually had alerts going out during the session, but it seemed like certainly the last month, it was almost every day we had something going. And I really do appreciate everybody's involvement, willingness to step up and to communicate with your legislators, because it did make a difference. We're hoping that as we go into the next session, it'll be a short session in 22 in February. We expect there to be some kind of a hybrid virtual session because of ongoing seismic issues associated with the state. So we're going to continue to rely on our membership base to provide the communication and the education and the advocacy that we need to have success on. So thank you for taking time out of your day to listen to this fairly extensive report. An awful lot of things for us to cover. But as I said earlier, we do have a physical report that will be coming out. It's very extensive and has quite a bit of detailed links in there for you to be able to find the information that you need to have. So again, thank you very much on behalf of the entire lobby team. It's a great group to work with, and appreciate all the help.